swear by the moon and the stars in the skies, and I swear like the shadow that's by your side. I see the questions in your eyes.
So yes, well, we had to begin with all for one, right? We're going to talk today about the idea of pledges, vows, oaths, promises. They don't seem to all be the same. Obviously, one reason for doing this right around now is the administration of an oath of office very, very soon. But also, I'm going to be honest with you about the kind of intellectually down market origins of this idea for me. I was watching a show that I've become quite addicted to called Lioness. It's a Taylor Sheridan show. Taylor Sheridan shows tend to sort of look at America maybe a little bit differently than how people, East Coast liberals like me, look at it. And so Zoe Saldana plays this soldier, among other things, and she's having a fight with her husband who wants her to quit because what she's doing is very dangerous. And she finally says, I took an oath. And she says a little bit more about that, and it becomes clear in the conversation that this oath, you should pardon the expression, trumps everything. That it's just a bigger there's a hierarchy of promises. And this is at the top of that hierarchy. And that really got me thinking about all of this because we talk about these things all the time. We kind of toss these things off. But what kind of status do they have, and how do they acquire that status? Where does that status come from? We have some great guests to explore that with us today, starting with Joanne Pierce, Professor Emerita in the Department of Religious Studies at the College of the Holy Cross, who specializes in medieval Christianity, particularly liturgy and worship. Joanne Pierce, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Colin. I'm very happy to be here.
So we should talk a little bit about this idea of an oath. An oath, as you point out, sort of within the world of philosophy, would be defined as kind of a speech act. And I think both of those words are important. An oath is something that you say, but you often are doing something while you say it. An oath typically isn't something that you say all alone on a mountaintop all by yourself, right? There's often ceremony that goes with us. But say a little bit more about how you perceive this idea of an oath.
Right. The performative speech act phrase that you use comes from semiotics and philosophy, but it also it connects very nicely with the origins of what we think of as oaths, which are transactions in a way with a higher power, the gods, or God, or some other kind of divinity somewhere, that you state that you are you are going to do something, and by that statement, you actually do it. You begin doing it by the simple statement, by the God, whatever, that this is your intention. And when we look at it in terms of contemporary society, or, other societies as well, by saying this, in a way, you state an intent, but you also change your relationship with other members of your culture or other members of your society. And you're right when you say there is a kind of a pyramid or a hierarchy of these kinds of oaths.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about sort of how we call attention to what we're doing when we swear an oath. And typically, there is, you might even say, kind of a kinetic aspect to it. It might be a speech act, but there's often something that you do. I mean, presidents and members of the Supreme Court, when they're sworn in, they typically have their hand on a Bible. I was a Boy Scout. That we were instructed when we said the Scout's oath, we had to believe, I think it was our right-handed to go up in the air at a right angle, and we had to hold up only 3 fingers. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. You're not just saying something. There's some activity that goes along with it that I think also is intended to put it in a different category.
Yes, that's correct. Well, first of all, before we start talking about objects, we should also remember that oaths are usually made in the presence of witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say make a private vow on top of a mountain, as you said earlier, but you would be the only one who would act upon it, and it wouldn't change your relationship. But yes, there have usually been specific actions. For example, in the Old Testament, when patriarchs or kings would take oaths, they would, as the Bible says, they would put their hand under each other person's thigh. And what that really means is near or underneath their testicles, which is a very, how shall I put this, an act of trust and an act of commitment that you have each other in each other's grasp, so to speak. We swear oaths by raising our right hand. That comes from the medieval period in England, where a person who was a cleric could have been excused from certain crimes because they were part of the church. And if that were the case, they would have been branded on their thumb. So they raise their right hand to show that they have never been accused of this act before. But if the brand shows, then they are handed over for some kind of a trial. It's interesting because if you do not have a right hand in the United States, at least, you can use your left hand. You can put a hand over your heart, or you can make some other kind of action that indicates assent. Right. Now, other objects, people would often swear oaths in the church. There was a lot of intermingling between secular society and religious society. So if you went, you might swear an oath on the liturgical book that contained the Gospels. You might swear an oath holding a chalice that held the relics of a saint. You might swear an oath that becomes actually swearing an oath on the Bible as it continues into the United States. And what's interesting, I looked this up in preparation for this. There's one president who did put his hand on a Bible, but did not say the word swear. He said the word affirm, and we can talk about that later, because swearing seems always to imply the presence of, in the face of, God. There have even been cases of those who have been sworn in for lesser offices. One woman was sworn in as an ambassador with her hand on a Kindle. And another woman was sworn in on an office in the South. The half of the oath, she had her hand on a Bible, and the other half, she had her hand on the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Well, yes. So there's a lot of kind of mission creep here, or there's a way in which, in the modern age, Americans being kind of polytheistic and diverse, not everybody's very comfortable with all of this. So, for example, the whole idea of swearing in witnesses has evolved somewhat away from the Bible in many cases. And as you say, there's often the word affirm is sometimes used. But actually, we can get to that in a second. I think it's important to say that somewhere in everything that we're talking about is the implication of consequences if you don't hold true to your oath, right? One of the reasons we're doing all of this, we're swearing you in as a member of the American military, or as a Supreme Court justice, or as a president, or as a witness, is because if in fact you don't hold true to what you've promised, there will be consequences. Maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, certainly. If you break an oath, well, at least historically, if you broke an oath, you were a noble or something, and betrayed your overlord, you would actually be dishonored in the eyes of many in the culture. And if your sovereign caught you, you would probably be executed or jailed, that kind of thing. if a witness in a USA in an American trial, for example, if a witness is found to have lied under oath, well, that's a criminal act, and that we call it perjury, and you can be legally punished for that.
But let's take that as an interesting example, because the judge could in a different world, the judge could say from the bench, if you lie, that's a felony, and you could be punished, and that would be the end of it. That could happen. It's not what happens, because I think part of this is you at least get somebody who's being sworn in. If they're not going to repeat the oath, which will be the case when a president is sworn in, at least they say, yes, or I do, or something like that, either with their hand on their Bible or their hand somewhere. In other words, there's the enlisting of the sworn-in person's participation, which is, I think, a little bit stronger somehow than just the judge saying, you better not lie or you could go to jail.
Oh, absolutely. That's why there are various formulas for swearing in jurors, and they're sworn in. At least on Judge Judy, they're sworn in before Judge Judy even walks into the courtroom, and they're very carefully worded. I have a sample from, I think it's North Carolina. Do you swear that the evidence you shall give to the court in this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And then you optional can say, so help you God. So this covers every possible, so to speak, form of deception. You can't go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
No, I was going to say you can't hold anything back. You can't lie, and you have to have the intention throughout everything you say that it is true. Yeah.
All right, let's hear actually what it's going to sound like in just a week or two when the new president is sworn in. Here's the clip from the inauguration of President Joe Biden. So this would have been January 20th of 2021. A1, Maestro.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
Office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
I should say, just to kind of link everything to what we've been talking about, link this to everything that we've been talking about. Subsequent to that particular swearing in on the internet, the always reliable internet, a rumor started to circulate that it was some kind of weird Bible. It was a Bible connected to the Masonic order or the Illuminati. In fact, it was a family heirloom from the late 19th century. It was, but I mean, it was just a regular English-speaking Roman Catholic Bible that he was being sworn in with. But right away, people started getting nervous. What kind of Bible was that? But I mean, in a way, I think, Joanne, it's also, you sense that this is almost a price of admission, right? You want to be president? Okay, there's one last thing you've got to do. You've got to swear this oath, to which presumably, once again, you can be held. But I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yes, that act of swearing the oath, as it is in its present form, is what makes you legally and morally the president. And speaking of rumors, there was a rumor when President Obama was sworn in. He had to be sworn in privately the next day because the Chief Justice bungled the words that he actually told Obama. And, you know, conspiracy theories suggest that he might have done it deliberately, and so that it wouldn't be caught. And if the words were misspoken, the oath would not have been effective.
You know, as we become a society in which people perceive things very differently, this particular tradition is also kind of the same. There are increasingly there are instances where a public official will not swear an oath of office. It comes up recently if state constitutions have been modified to include a right to abortion, and the person being sworn in does not believe that there should be a right to abortion and doesn't feel that he or she can take an oath. They often will just ask to affirm something else or just refuse to take an oath of office. You can see it in the medical profession too. I think the Hippocratic Oath is, now it's, if your medical school happens to do that on graduation day, you might take the Hippocratic Oath, but you're much more likely to have to absorb and perform under a more secular and more recent code of medical ethics. And I wonder what you think about that, the idea that, maybe oaths aren't really, and promises and vows and things like that aren't quite what they used to be, and maybe we have better standards and practices these days.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
The medical oath is an interesting example, and in the original oath, it states that that a doctor, a physician, will first do no harm. And you will notice that I think in all states, I could be wrong, doctors do not participate in the death penalty, in the execution of criminals in those states that have it. Because of that oath, or because of whatever statement they make upon graduation, they don't all say the exact oath. That is explicitly or implicitly part of it.
Well, also the Hippocratic Oath, there's a whole line about how you will charge your patients for the services that you perform. You'll not try to make money in other ways through your medicine, which I think seems. Well, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, they lived a long time before insurance companies.
Right. And television,
And television, yes, exactly.
Yeah. Dr. Oz and Dr. Phil and all those kinds of people, it just turns out there are some other opportunities out there. So we should also say that, and this is going to come up a little bit in our third segment, but the Pledge of Allegiance is a similar kind of thing. Its status is not entirely clear, the degree to which it is binding. It seems less binding than an oath. I mean, something that school kids do every day for years and years and years without really having much of an idea what indivisible means. It just didn't seem like it has the same kind of status as something as specific to one person as an oath.
That's true. The pledge, a pledge, there are, as you said, a hierarchy of these. As a matter of fact, one nation, the phrase "under God," if I remember correctly, was added by Eisenhower in the face of the Cold War. So that was not originally, according to what I've read, part of the Pledge of Allegiance. In addition, there's no penalty if you decide, you might have legalities, but if you decide that you want to become a citizen of another country, there actually is a structure by which you can renounce your U.S. citizenship, or if it's permitted, you can swear a pledge and become the citizen of another country, and there is no penalty. That's up to you.
All right, we're going to grab a break here. We're going to focus more specifically on marital vows in the second segment. We're going to say farewell and thank you so much to Joanne Pierce, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Religious Studies at the College of the Holy Cross. We will be back.
From the grassroots up to the big time stride, make the right moves, get the votes on your side, in the Oval Office where you gotta preside. Oath of office, make you stand, make you call, from the Senate floor to the White House hall. Chesapeake got the game where the players ball, rise to the top where you're destined to fall. Track your platform, set the policy pace, handle scandals, keep your public face, negotiate deals in the national race with every choice.
With this ring, I promise I'll always love you, always love you. With this ring, I promise I'll always love you, always love you. They used to call me the wanderer who never wanted to settle down, yeah.
Oh, it pains me to fade this great song. But we want to talk about marital vows right now, and we want to have that conversation with Cheryl Mendelson, author, novelist, sometime philosophy professor, and author of, most relevantly for our purposes, Vows, the Modern Genius of an Ancient Rite. So Cheryl Mendelson, welcome to our show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is a very interesting book, too, because it takes us through the history and some of the legality of vows, but interspersed are your own stories, including a fairly disastrous start to your first marriage.
Really?
Actually, let's take a moment, because that's a good story. And so let's take a moment. So you're marrying what turns out to be the wrong guy. You almost kind of sort of might have even known that at the moment. And one giveaway was when the judge was performing the vows, the word troth was used. Explain what happened when that word came up.
We had been toddling along, following the lines, and my soon-to-be husband interrupted to say, "What's a troth?" And the judge, who was in his long black robes and very dignified, gave him such a dirty look and refused to answer and continued to the end of the ceremony. And then when it was all over, told him, "Troth means good faith and truth." And things went along that way for the entire marriage.
Well, not to defend your first husband, but I mean, I think there is some validity to the idea that we say some of these words without entirely understanding them. Even doing something as serious as getting married. There's a movie from the 80s called Best Friends, and Goldie Hawn and Burt Reynolds get married rather precipitously, I think, in Vegas. And there's an officiant who has a very thick accent. And when he comes to the phrase, I thee endow, he says it with his accent. He says, I thee endow. And they ask him several times what he's saying. And then they wind up just kind of numbly repeating that. They look at each other and say, I thee endow. It's obviously there for comedic effect. But there's some reality to that, right, Cheryl? I mean, there's antiquated language there that we don't necessarily understand.
Right. That's right. On the other hand, you have to look at it like it's an ancient building. I mean, you wouldn't tear down Notre Dame, or you wouldn't tear down the Parthenon, because it's a treasure that has come down to us, and so has this. And it has maybe now only one unfamiliar word, and that would be troth. I think what's more unfamiliar to us is the whole idea of what a solemn promise is. And there's so many unique things about the wedding vows from their history that I think the language is really not adequate. The ideas might be very out of fashion in some circles, but if you look at what they finally come down and say: love, honor, keep, which means protect and guard, keep only to you, and till death do us part. Those are the things that actually people still think are the heart of marriage, and they may not say it, but you take a Gallup poll shows that something like 88% of all Americans said that the fidelity vow, violating it, was wrong.
Yeah. So there's a lot of places I want to go here.
Yeah,
I'm actually reminded also of Lyle Levitt's song, She's No Lady, where he says, the preacher asked her, and she said, I do. The preacher asked me, and she said, he does too. But the provenance of all this stuff, which you trace very admirably in your book, I mean, it goes back to the Carolingian period, where we're really not even talking about man and wife at that point. We're really talking about vassals and serfs and things like that, right?
Yeah. The wedding vow is modeled on the fealty vow. And but it's one thing to keep in mind is I don't know, probably people would argue with me, I don't think it came from the church at all. The church took it over in the 12th century, but there are ancient poems from 900 in which people talk about, I'll read you a line. We had vowed for many a time that naught should come between us but death alone, and nothing else at all. And all that's changed. And now it's as though our marriage and our love had never been. Now, you tell me that pair didn't take marriage vows. It sure sounds, and I've got another poem, and I've got other stuff too that says, this is really old. The church took it over. It inserted religion. Today, you can take the vows. You can have your religion in it. If you have no religion, you can make them secular. And they have spread they began in this narrow region of Anglo-Normandy, and they spread more or less all over the world. A friend of mine in Japan says the majority of weddings there, people take them. People take them in Africa. I mean, not everywhere, but it's a world thing, and it's a treasure, and we should protect it, and we should understand it.
Yeah, actually, I love there's one from 1016 that you excerpt in your book.
Yeah.
And one thing that is clear is that this is an Anglo-Saxon man marrying what is probably a 2nd or 3rd century Viking woman. We just did a whole show about this too, so I recognized it right away from the names. I thought, it's a mixed marriage too. So they had them even then. So I guess the other thing we should say about this is somewhere in that transition from maybe late Middle Ages forward. We're dealing with the notion that the two sexes have different statuses and that the woman can be understood to some degree as property rather than a fully independent, a realized human like the groom. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, I can. The word obey and serve and to be buxom and bonny and stuff, all that stuff does come in there, and her role. However, keep in mind, this is progress. We're beginning with people being taken off on horseback and kidnapped to be married and sold and having no say at all. Whereas in this ceremony, she has to consent. She promises to obey and be good to him, but don't forget that so did a duke promise that to the king when he became the vassal of the king. So in making her, in essence, the vassal of her husband, they're giving her a leg up, a step up the status ladder. It's not putting her down. And that continues to evolve from that day to ours. And that vow obey has been gone from the modern secular and most religious rites for 100 years that I know of. There are some religions that still insist on it because they take the Gospel of Paul as being not the Gospel of St. Paul as being the Lord of marriage, but most people don't.
So, what we think about, I think, is that kind of highly formalized, almost boilerplate set of wedding vows probably traces itself back to Thomas Cranmer, who you read about. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yep.
And you can see him in Wolf Hall, read about him in Wolf Hall, or watch him on television.
Right.
And he's got a problem, right? He's got a king who wants a bunch of stuff that he's not supposed to have. And in a way, some of the adjustments that Cranmer makes are presumably an outgrowth of this problem solving he has to do.
Oh, and of his own history. He had an illegal marriage. Yeah, he was married as a priest, which was illegal. And the king, when he would attempt to get him to go along with clerical marriage, Henry said, no, we're not going to do that. So it really had to be secret. And he lived with a lot of tension on account of that. So he had a lot of anxiety. And then he's handling all of Henry's marriage problems, all the different wives, and putting some of them to death and divorcing, annulling a couple of them, so forth. Yeah, it was Cranmer who pulled together the most beautiful version of the words. And again, you can say, well, it's outmoded and it's not us, but lots of wonderful things have a different English rhythm from the one we speak, and we keep them because they're treasures. They've come down to us. We should protect them, unless you show that there's something really wrong with them.
Yeah, no, and we lament them when we lose that language too. I mean, the Book of Common Prayer, the Episcopal Book of which is where this occurs, when it was kind of rejiggered and modified to have a slightly more contemporary feel to it. And you didn't say it is meet and right so to do anymore. People miss saying it is meet and right so to do, whether they knew what that meant or not. They liked saying it because it sounded cool. So let's talk about something that you mentioned a few beats back, and that is this idea to have and to hold, to keep. Because the question arises, are there legally enforceable qualities to these vows? And it's certainly not a one-to-one mapping process, but these vows imply certain things. And as you write in your book, to keep means to may or to have and to hold. This all may have to do with the requirement, the sometimes legal requirement, that you guard and support the person you marry.
Yeah, you do still have a legal duty to keep your spouse, but at the time, not until the 1970s did this duty adhere to anyone but the husband. And at that time, the Supreme Court said, no, both men and women, they have to have this. You can't have laws that make only one party responsible for the other. And so the states all enacted laws about mutual keeping. You can find them all over the country now, the mutual keeping. But they don't have a lot of teeth to them. And in fact, they sometimes work to benefit creditors more than anyone else who can now go after both of them, not just one of them. So keep, and there are still about 15 or 16 states that have laws about fidelity, so that if you commit adultery and you divorce, you may well still be treated worse than the innocent party, according to the law of certain states, but probably not. Very probably those laws are pretty much dead on the books.
I like the fact that in the chapter where you deal with this idea of keeping, you begin with a whole bunch of little news briefs about various husbands and wives who've jumped into the water and punched sharks in the nose, or lay their body on top of their wife during a tornado or something. That may not be enforceable as law, but that's the implication, right? That's how serious this is.
That is how serious it is. And one of the things I think we could work on a little bit is to understand just how serious these vows are and how unique. You look at all these vows that Professor Pierce was talking about just before in the earlier thing. None of them are mutual. None of them are two people standing and saying to each other, I promise you this and you promise it back to me, which is quite interesting. Think about that, right? And so these mutual vows of protection and honoring and so forth are also emotionally powerful in a way, and intimate in a way that nothing else that I know of compares to. Well, what was I going to say with that?
Well, I mean, to the point you're making, for example, we were joking about I thee and do before, but with all my worldly goods, I thee and thou, that was spoken by the groom. I don't think in the Book of Common Prayer or much of anywhere else, the woman had to say it.
No, that's right. She never had to say that. So there were still differences, and there still are for some people, but most people just leave those things out. But all I'm holding out for is that core, those two sets of promises. Will you honor, keep, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, and so on. Those things, I think they're all still the same. I think they were true for Odysseus and Penelope. I think they're true for people today. And this doesn't mean we all succeed. I failed. I'm sure and I know I'm one of zillions who has been through a divorce. But that doesn't mean we don't honor, and that doesn't mean that millions and millions of people don't actually succeed in this to an extent that makes their lives very rich.
Yeah. I mean, Penelope set the bar pretty high there. She hung in there. She kept it real. And meanwhile, Americans sort of think everything's fungible, everything's malleable. We begin to modify stuff. There's that lovely with my body, I thee worship, which Americans decide pretty quickly they're not going to. That's in the 18th century. I'm sure I'm assuming it's some kind of puritanical, let's not talk about all that stuff. But as we go along, there's this sense, okay, well, we could reword this, we could change this. And it leads up to a point where, according to one study that I'm not sure I entirely believe, roughly half of Americans say that they have, if they've gotten married, they've written their own vows or modified the existing vows. And so suddenly everything is kind of your own personal choice. Say what you want to say about that.
Yeah, I have lots of feelings about that. I don't think you can define marriage as being personal. It's not a personal thing. It's an institutional thing. It's something that goes on. The only reason to have a wedding is because the couple needs to stand in front of their world and say, hey, we're together in ways that really count and in ways that we need your protection. And if you won't give it to us, we know our chances as a couple are kind of zilch. I mean, if you're all going to work against us and treat us as though we don't belong to each other economically, physically, domicile and so forth, we don't have a chance as a couple. So the wedding is an event that exists to protect the couple and unify them with their society, so that on both sides there's obligations. Don't forget, the guests are not just guests, they're witnesses. They're there also to hold the couple in exchange for our protection. You're going to live this way, and they do choose to live that way, and it's the way they want to live. This is all a
hilariously,
mouthful.
yeah, hilariously to me, this whole idea of writing your own vows or rewriting the vows to suit yourself, it turns out that it's hard to do, and you get into arguments with the person you're going to marry. And there are now outsourcing. There's a thevowwhisperer.com and vowsandspeeches.com. You can hire somebody else and say, you write it, we'll say it.
This is becoming very popular, and it's just losing track of the whole thing. It's it's an evolution of the right in directions that undermine it. And I wish more people would abandon all that. It would be so much easier just to say the classic words that say it all, say what your marriage really is going to be, and you don't have to do that work of writing and all that. My husband and I, we're both writers. Yeah. We tried to do it, and we finally tore it up and said, "This is no good. No good. We're not doing it."
Yeah,
so
no. There's a reason some of these things lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yes,
it's not
because
just
they say it.
Yeah, because they got it right, and then they kept it that way. I just wanted to say one last thing about a sign that within the context of our civil religion, this is meaningful. I was thinking about this today. That not a huge deal was made of it, but when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, he was the first previously divorced man who had been elected president. And then we didn't do it again until 2017. To me, that says something. That says to me that no matter how blithe or dismissive Americans may seem about this stuff, they take it seriously.
They do take it seriously, and they're not sure how to. So sometimes a little history gets you back on the path, makes you understand why it is not silly to say, I pledge thee my troth. Maybe something like that might help a little bit.
Well, Cheryl Mendelsohn, you are a treat to talk to. And the book is Vows, The Modern Genius of an Ancient Rite. And we're going to have to say goodbye, but come back soon. And we promise we'll have you back. Just tell us what you want to talk about. And meanwhile, we're going to take a little break. We're going to talk about that Pledge of Allegiance to wrap things up.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
That's actually Andrea Hall, a firefighter and union leader at the Biden inauguration in 2021. She also did that Pledge of Allegiance in sign language as well. Before we get onto that, I want to pledge allegiance to the maestro. That's Dylan Reyes, our technical producer. And I've pledged allegiance so many times to Lily Tyson, our senior producer and the producer of this episode, that it just comes very naturally to me. Joining us now to talk about that Pledge of Allegiance, we've already referenced it a little bit here, but we're going to go in deeper with Charles Dorn, professor of education at Bowdoin College. He's the co-author of Patriotic Education in a Global Age. Charles Dorn, welcome to our conversation.
Thanks for having me.
So Paul Simon wrote a song called In My Little Town, and it begins, in my little town, I grew up believing that God keeps his eyes on us all. He used to lean upon me as I pledged allegiance to the wall. And to me, I grew up in the 60s. Pledge of Allegiance was every day. And when you do something every day, it can't possibly be meaningful to you, particularly when you're in second grade. And that's kind of, I feel like, the status that the pledge has for a lot of people. It's something that they've said a lot, not necessarily something that they've thought about a lot or feel bound by.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is the case. And you've got to love the lyric, I pledge allegiance to the wall, right? Mm-hmm. Because, of course, the flag was up in the corner of the classroom usually. And no, that's right. I mean, the pledge is an interesting thing. It has a really interesting history. But as you're suggesting, the current status is, at least in most school classrooms, that it's just this thing that happens. It's ubiquitous, but it also for the most part, doesn't stir up a lot of controversy or trouble unless you try to do something with it.
Right.
right?
We should talk about that. I mean, Vice President Harris messed it up recently, and that caused a stir. But my thoughts, Chuck, go back to '88. George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis are contending for the presidency, and Dukakis has vetoed a bill in Massachusetts as its governor that I think would have required teachers to lead the Pledge of Allegiance for all classes, and Bush just beat him up about it relentlessly. And it hurt him. I think it hurt Dukakis, and he spent so much time defending himself about that he didn't get to some of the more relevant issues. But that's an indication of how seriously in modernity this can be taken. As you say, more when it's done wrong than when it's done right.
No, that's right. I mean, look, most superintendents of schools have a lot of important things they have to deal with. They don't want to have to deal with the controversy that comes from, upsetting the apple cart relating to the pledge. And so you just leave the pledge alone. You don't go anywhere near it. You just leave it the way it is, and it's fine. The minute it becomes controversial is when you try to remove it or modify it or change it. Then it becomes a flashpoint. But for the most part, for students in schools today, as you're suggesting, it's something that happens. Many of them stand, some don't. They're not required by law to do that. Many of them recite it openly. Many don't. They're not required by law to do that. And it's just something that happens as a part of the school day.
We should say that the bleeding edge of all this tends to be either Jehovah's Witnesses or humanists/atheists who have problems with the under God part. So in 1940, the Supreme Court rules against the Jehovah's Witnesses. Felix Frankfurter says that conscientious scruples have not, in the course of the long struggle for religious toleration, relieved the individual from obedience to a general law not aimed at the promotion or restriction of religious beliefs. 3 years later, they completely flip-flop on this. And take the Jehovah's Witnesses side. I don't know, say a little bit about this. This is another place that the pledge becomes newly relevant. Anytime there's somebody who really doesn't want, for reasons of principle, to say certain things.
That's right. So what's interesting about this is most people who know something about this think it's because, of the under God phrase. That was actually added in 1954 during a period of sort of communist hysteria in the United States. And we were afraid that, the communists were making inroads into the public schools. And so godless communism was a fear. And so under God was added to the pledge. The case that you're referring to, the Gabaitis, case, begins actually in 1935. So well before under God, the phrase under God is added to the pledge. And in this case, you had a Jehovah's Witness family that felt that pledging allegiance to a flag was idolatry. And violating God's law, and basically then sort of refused to do that. The two children, Billy and Lillian, wound up being sent home from school, and there was a case that made it to the Supreme Court. The lower rulings sided with the family, and then the Supreme Court essentially overturned those rulings and came down on the side of the Minersville school board, basically saying that the pledge was legit. But the context that you're talking about is really, really important here. It's 1940. We've got the fall of Dunkirk. You've got the Nazi armies, raging through Europe beginning the previous September. And there's this real fear that, democracy and freedom are in retreat. And so trying to make the argument that it would be okay to not express loyalty in this way was seen as a major problem for the court. And as you say, it only took 3 years and some changes to the makeup of the court for the Supreme Court to overturn their own decision in a 6-3 decision, saying that that it is not legal to require children to stand and recite the pledge in public school.
We need to go back a little bit further very quickly, Chuck. We're running out of time here, but we need to pay a visit to another family, and their name is Bellamy. They have several illustrious members, but it is from this family that we get the Pledge of Allegiance. And whenever there's sort of the typical conservative arguments about this, I would often bring up that the Bellamys were Christian socialists, which make everybody very uncomfortable. But say a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, and the first thing I have to say, is that we have this sort of renewed controversy and some very, very good archival evidence suggesting that Francis Bellamy, who has been credited with being the author of the Pledge of Allegiance for a very long time, was actually not the author. And that it was a 13-year-old boy in Kansas who wrote it, submitted it as a part of a competition to a magazine called the Youth's Companion, which was the publication that Francis Bellamy was working for. And there's some pretty good documentary evidence that Francis didn't write it, and instead this 13-year-old boy from Kansas wrote it. Quite remarkably, it's hard to get your head around this a little bit. The name of that boy was Frank Bellamy, no relation to Francis at all. Nevertheless, Francis Bellamy, has been credited with being the author, and he was working for a magazine that was looking to sell American flags as a part of the flags in every classroom and every schoolhouse movement, which had developed in the late 1800s. And as a part of the Columbians' anniversary celebration, so this is the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, so 1892. As you know, this is the Columbian Exposition, Chicago, the White City. This was all a part of that celebration. And as a part of that, kids were going to gather and celebrate America. And it was believed that that could best be done by having lots of flags in classrooms and having kids recite a national Pledge of Allegiance. And the United States didn't have one. There were a bunch of different pledges out there that people had written that were used in different places, but there was no, nationally accepted, acknowledged Pledge of Allegiance. And so Bellamy wrote one. It was published in Youth's Companion. It got some traction on Celebration Day for the Columbus anniversary. And it probably would have faded at that point if there hadn't been a larger movement already existing to Americanize a great wave of immigration into immigrants into the United States in the late 19th century. And also to try to continue to figure out how to heal the wounds resulting from the Civil War. So there were a number of different things that sort of intersected that made this sort of the national soil fertile for a Pledge of Allegiance to arise, and that's where our pledge came from.
We've only got a minute or two left here, but I think it's worth noting that similar to some of the other things we've talked about today, and similar also to football players kneeling during the anthem, this is becoming a kind of a thing that tests certain questions about whether or not the American Republic has an obligation to live up to its side of the pledge. Justin Jones, one of the Tennessee legislators who was expelled from the state house there, I think it was when he got back in, he said he didn't want to be asked to lead the Pledge of Allegiance that opens every day of every session. And he said it was performative patriotism, that there was an insurrectionist for a president and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And it's an interesting thing. I mean, we got about a minute left, Chuck, but it feels as though this is the thing. Our conversations about the pledge are far from over.
That's absolutely right. I have to say my colleague and co-author Randy Curran and I started working on our book during the Obama administration. And for the most part, quite frankly, people weren't interested in talking about it. It was like, oh yeah, the pledge, no big deal. And then Donald Trump was elected, and suddenly it was like the hot topic, right? Political education, indoctrination, patriotic education. It comes and goes, it ebbs and flows over time in the national culture. And I imagine it will be, back in a really fierce way over the next 4 years.
Or maybe in a week or two. Charles Dorn, a professor of education at Bowdoin College. He is the co-author of Patriotic Education in a Global Age. Thanks for that conversation. Thanks to you for listening. We pledge to be back very soon with another show.